Well, first of all, let me explain about this title. I didn't ask for the title Chief Internet Evangelist. When I went to work for Google, they said, what title do you want? And I said, how about Archduke? And, they said, well, it doesn't quite fit in our nomenclature. And so they said, why don't you be our Chief Internet Evangelist? And considering that I spent the last 35 years trying to get more Internet built all around the world, that's not a bad title. The statistics are tough, though. We only have 3 billion people online right now. There are 4 billion more people that we have to get online between now and sometime. The good part is that mobiles are turning out to be a very rapid way of getting people in touch with the Internet. And for some folks, it'll be their first introduction to access to Internet services. How often do you hear there's an app for that? Well, that's exactly what's going on. All those apps are able to do what they do, mostly because they have some ability to talk to a computer somewhere on the Internet that does something for you. So when you tweet something, for example, one message comes out of your mobile, goes to a computer on the Internet, and that computer blasts the stuff out to all the other mobiles that you're trying to send to. So this synergy between having mobile access to the Internet and the ability of the mobile to activate and take advantage of and leverage the computing power in the computers of the Internet is what makes the combination so powerful. So I wanted to mention something to you about career choice for just a second. Now, you're all interested in science and technology. I'm going to recommend astrophysics, but let me explain why. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, that's it. So just think about this for a minute. Around the late 1800s, we thought that we knew everything there was to know about the universe, and all we had to do was measure the physical constants more accurately, and we'd have a good Newtonian model for everything. Then Einstein comes along in 1905 and blows the whole thing up. Then the quantum theorists come along, and they blow up Einstein. Then the fellows who were doing string theory sort of blow up the quantum theory guys, because the quantum theory guys don't have a good theory for gravity. They only have a good theory for fundamental particle behavior. And then we discover that we only know about 5% of the universe, because the other 95% is some combination of dark matter and dark energy about which we know almost nothing. We're starting to map the dark matter, but we don't really understand what it is. We haven't found the Higgs boson that's supposed to give mass to is the fundamental particle that gives mass to the other visible particles. So the basic situation is that we don't understand 95% of the universe. Well, that means that if you go into astrophysics, you have an extremely high probability of getting the Nobel Prize for almost anything you do, because we don't know anything. So, just figure it out. So let me come back now to the Internet side of things. This got started way back in 1973, if you can believe that, probably before many of you were born. And I hope maybe even before some of your parents were born. No, I don't even want to think about that. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is what has been happening in the Internet environment. I mentioned the mobiles. There's more that's going on. The ability to assemble huge amounts of information, then do something with it, so-called big data and big processing. If you go back to somewhere over here, if you go over to the left, you'll see several booths that are describing activities, one of which is large-scale computation. One of the things that we now have the ability to do is to assemble exabytes worth of data, 10 to the 18th bytes worth of data, and then do something useful with that, to model it, to analyze it. Some of the things that we discover will be a consequence of assembling large amounts of data in this way and then processing it in order to make more apparent what the data actually means. There's a very famous quote from a guy named Richard Hamming, who said that the purpose of measurement is not numbers, it's insight. And that's really true. That what we want is to derive out of that data what that data actually means. So the Internet world is rapidly transforming itself. There are moments of embarrassment, however. When Bob Kahn and I did the original design of the Internet, we thought it was an experiment, and we said, well, how much address space do we need? How many things will there have to be on the Internet in order to, or do we have to plan for, in order to make this experiment a reasonable test of the theory that you could link many different networks together using this technology? So we thought about it, and we said, well, let's see, there's national scale networks are very expensive, and so probably you wouldn't have more than one or two per country. And way back in 1973, maybe there were 120, 150 countries. So we thought 8 bits of country ID would be enough, 256 networks, 2 per country, and then the remaining 24 bits of a 32-bit address would give 10 million possible terminations per country. And at that time, computers were typically very large-scale time-shared systems serving 1,000 to 10,000 people, so we thought there certainly wouldn't need to be more than 10 million of those in any one country. So 32 bits of address space was what we chose for the internet experiment. I want to emphasize, we thought it was an experiment. The problem is the experiment never ended. So here it is, 2012. We ran out of the IP version 4, Internet Protocol version 4 address space in February of last year. So there is a different and new internet packet format that has 128 bits of address space, 3.4 times 10 to the 38th addresses. On June 6th this year, all of us who are capable of it are going to turn on the IPv6 format operation. So we're going to launch the IPv6 network on June 6th this year. I hope that all of your home equipment and all the equipment in your labs knows how to speak IPv6, because that's what you're going to need to do in order for this network to keep growing. Speaking of growing, my colleagues and I at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory back in 1998 asked ourselves the question, what should we be doing in 1998 that would be beneficial and useful 25 years hence? And the reason we asked the question that way is that around 1998 was 25 years after Bob and I did the original internet design, and so I was thinking, well, it took about 25 years to get the internet to the point where the public had access to it, it was commercially available, and it was a growing phenomenon on an international scale. So the question then was, in 1998, what should we be looking at for 25 years hence? So we thought about that for a while, and we said, well, why don't we figure out how to build a network that would span the solar system? It's not because we thought that there were little green men on Mars that we wanted to communicate with, but what we did believe is that we needed better communication for spacecraft, both for manned and robotic exploration, than point-to-point radio links, which is what had been used for all the time since 1964 to do exploration around the solar system, was to transmit data to and from Earth directly on a single radio link. So we said, well, how could we build a more rich networking environment in order to take advantage of the possibility of multiple devices on the surface of a planet like we have on Mars today, or multiple orbiters, or spacecraft flying in tandem that need to communicate locally as well as back to Earth for, say, interferometric studies. So there were a variety of motivations to have a richer networking environment. So we said, well, why don't we use TCP/IP? It works on Earth. It ought to work elsewhere. And the honest truth is it does work. It'll work on the surface of Mars. It'll work inside of a spacecraft where it's a relatively low latency environment. The problem is it doesn't work very well between the planets. So if we do the math, think about how far Earth and Mars are apart from each other while we're in our orbits. When we're closest together, it's still about 35 million miles, and we're farthest apart, it's 235 million miles. At the speed of light, it takes between 3.5 and 20 minutes for a signal to propagate between Earth and Mars. The consequence of that is that the TCP/IP protocols, which were built to operate in relatively low delay environments, don't work very well. Flow control doesn't work very well when the guy on the other end says, stop, I can't take any more, and you don't hear that for 20 minutes. So, there's this other problem. It's disrupted communication. You know, when you're talking to something on the surface of a planet and the planet's rotating, eventually you can't talk to it because it's on the wrong side of the planet. We have the same problem with orbiters. So we have a disrupted and variably delayed environment. So we said, okay, we need to design a new set of protocols, which we did. We went through several iterations of this new design for delay and disruption tolerant networking. This bundle protocol is now operating on board the space station. It's also on board the Epoxy spacecraft, which has visited 2 comets so far, and I hope it will visit some more. So we're using those 2 spacecraft as test points for this interplanetary internet design. We have all of the NASA facilities around the United States using these protocols in a test bed environment, and we've offered freely the design of the protocols and source code to the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems, which standardizes space-based communications. So what we're hoping is that if it's adopted as a standard, perhaps this year, that new spacecraft that get launched will have the capability to run the bundle protocols, and that will allow them to be repurposed after they finish their primary mission to become nodes of an interplanetary backbone. So now you might say, well, that's all very nice, but why do you need an interplanetary backbone? And I sort of get the idea that when you launch a mission, you could use the backbone for communication, either for local communications or to get back to Earth. But, you know, what else could you do with it? Well, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which sponsored the Internet design, which sponsored the ARPANET, which is a predecessor to the Internet, which also sponsored the design of the interplanetary Internet architecture, also sponsored some of the testing of the bundle protocols. DARPA just recently made a grant to a joint research program to design a spacecraft that could get to the nearest star in 100 years. It was called 100 YSS, 100-year spacecraft or spaceship. So let's think a little bit about this. The nearest star is 4.4 light years away. Problem number one, current propulsion systems would take us 65,000 years to get to the nearest star. That's a little long for an ARPA project, actually. That's, what, 6 times longer than our civilization has existed. So we have first problem figuring out how to get a propulsion system that'll get us up to 20% the speed of light. And oh, by the way, we'd like to slow down and go into orbit when we get to the other end so we can do some surveying as opposed to zipping through at 20% the speed of light and getting 2 snapshots. Then we have another problem, and that's communication. How do I build a communication system that I can modulate it at reasonable speed that can go be detected over a 4 light year distance? And of course, the problem gets worse as we go farther and farther out. So I don't have a good answer to that question yet. That's part of my interest, is in figuring out how to do that. One possibility is a femtosecond laser, 10 to the minus 15th pulse coming out of a laser, which if you could compress, say, 100 watts of energy into 10 to the minus 15 seconds, it's a very, very big signal. But even so, even if you have a collimated laser going all the way back in the direction of our solar system, you're still going to have beam spread. So you're going to have some kind of a synthetic aperture detector in order to pick up that signal. Now you know why I need an interplanetary backbone, because I want to build a synthetic aperture receiver that can detect this femtosecond pulsing that's coming from the nearest star, assuming we actually get a spacecraft to go there. So that's the interstellar network. So we've got interplanetary network, and we have an interstellar network. Now, there was mention of galactic networks. I don't know how to do that. Intergalactic is really tough. Part of the reason being that there's too many hundreds of thousands or millions of light years between us and them. So the only hope there is if there's a possibility of what we'll call quantum communication. All of you know about quantum entanglement, but that's correlation. That just says you can take 2 particles, 2 photons, 2 electrons, and hit them with a laser, causing their state to become entangled. Now, all that means is that when you separate them and measure the state of one, you know that the other will be in the complementary state. That's not communication. What that is correlation. If it were possible to force the state of an entangled particle so that you could push it into a particular, say, spin up or spin down state, then you'd be forcing communication to happen, because you'd know what the state of the other guy was because you forced it to be that, whatever it was. That would be really interesting, because it would be instantaneous communication. As near as we can tell, that correlation has no time delay associated with it. To make matters more weird, it turns out that it doesn't have to be a photon or an electron. There have been examples of entangled states of rather large quantities of molecules. And I don't know if any of you have been reading the recent 2-slit test. You remember how the question about electrons going through one slit, or photons going through one slit, and then you put up 2 slits and you transmit a photon beam through this, and you see an interference pattern on the other side. The only way that could happen would be if a single photon went through both slits. How could it possibly do that? Well, it's supposed to be representable as a waveform as well as a particle, which gets into the big wave and particle debate. But now large-scale molecules have actually been tested in this same 2-slit, 1-slit experiment. The implication of that is that matter exists in some very peculiar way that is not entirely condensed. Now, I don't know what I just said because I'm just a computer scientist, but the idea that somehow we don't exist exactly the way we think we do. You know, like the solid matter isn't solid. If you really look inside, it's mostly empty space. And can you imagine the chair being entangled with something else and going through a two-slit experiment and having, and I don't know what an interference pattern of two chairs looks like, actually. But the point here is that we know a lot less about the way the universe works than we thought we did. And that's why it's important for you to do what you're doing, which is to go find out answers to questions like that. All right, so look, I could go on, and you don't want me to do that. I'm happy to respond to questions if I have an answer, and if I don't, I'll admit I don't. And if you don't have any questions, I'm going to start asking you questions. So there. Anyway, thanks for letting me start out the Fire Chat today, and I'm looking forward to hearing the results of this conference and, of course, the award ceremony in a couple of days' time. So let's do questions if you have any. Yes, sir.
How do you think the internet is affecting the structure of the human brain, especially in very young people?
Okay, let me repeat the question. The question is, how does the internet affecting the brains of young people? Well, one person claimed that it was making us all stupid because we didn't remember anything anymore. We just Googled it. And that's almost half true. I mean, I have to admit, I think of Google as my solution to Alzheimer's. If I can't remember something, I Google it, and I find I can't find stuff on my own disk drive. It's often out on the net somewhere anyway, so I find it that way. There is evidence, I think all of you should know this, that the brain is plastic. That is, I don't mean it's made out of plastic, but it has the ability to adapt and change. There's a kind of a slow war going on inside of your brain all the time. Here's an experiment, for example, that was done. Someone had one hand that was just bound to, he avoided using the hand. It was covered up with cotton and other things to minimize the amount of signal that that hand would deliver to the part of the brain that controls that hand. And they were using either functional MRI or one of the other dynamic measurement mechanisms to watch what was happening inside the brain as the left hand was being used to manipulate while the right hand was being very quiet. And what they discovered is that over a period of time, more and more brain cells in the brain devoted to the left hand took over more territory of brain cells that had been visible using the right hand. So what's going on here is that as your body receives signals, the brain responds. There's new growth of neurons. There are a variety of other physical effects that we can see. So the answer is that there's some indication that people interacting with these very, very rapid video games or doing multitasking, having 16 windows up on the machine while you're watching video with the headsets on, listening to streaming audio, is causing a significant amount of change and adaptation in the neural structures of the brain. Now, exactly what that means, I don't know. I don't know whether that means all of us will be able to multitask faster than we could before. That might make us better spacecraft pilots. I don't know. But there is a very definite effect. It's not just internet. I mean, it's this general interaction with computer-based systems and multiple tasks that are going on that have a visible effect. Okay, other questions? Yes, way in the back. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing you very well, and it's my fault, so if you want to come a little closer, it would help me.
The original rise of the internet basically gave birth to the information era. How do you see the internet continuing to influence our society, and what do you think the next phase of that development is?
It's a good question. Now, of course, you've asked a computer scientist a philosophical and sociological question, so you deserve the answer that you get, right? If I really understood that, I mean, this is like the question of what's the internet doing to the brain. First observation I would make is that even in the earliest days of the predecessor network, the ARPANET, we recognized that there was a huge social aspect to this computer networking. Electronic mail got invented in 1971. So I started using it when it was invented. And we noticed very, very quickly that it became a medium of social interaction. Distribution lists got created almost immediately. The first one was, guess what? Sci-fi lovers. What do you expect? They're all engineers. They all read science fiction. So we had a distribution list for science fiction. And the next one was a restaurant evaluation list with the Palo Alto area called Yum Yum coming out of Stanford. So we saw very, very quickly that there was a social element to this. We're seeing it even more dramatically now as you see social networking taking off in the form of Facebook and Google Plus and some of the other applications. So sociologically speaking, I think that we are maintaining a larger number of interactions and let me call them friendships or contact anyway with a larger number of people. One question that might arise is how deep are those interactions? Do we have a larger number of friends, but with whom we have a more and more shallow interaction? I tend to resist the theory that online interactions are necessarily shallow. I travel a lot. I stay in touch with my family members on a regular basis by means of email, by means of either Skype or Google Talk or video conferencing. I don't tweet, to be honest with you. But the whole idea here is that the ability to contact. Oh, I see. That's just the groaning cart with all of this stuff on it. I thought one member of the audience was deciding this should be over now. So I think that we're seeing people taking advantage of these new ways of interacting with each other. I actually believe that this is an advantage because I am able to maintain relationships over a much longer period of time than I could, and more consistently than I could in the past. There are some surprises, though. An old one came out after email was invented. When I finally got to DARPA in 1976, we thought that the amount of travel that would be required to do research would go down because people would just interact with each other over the net. So a few years later, we decided to test our hypothesis, and we looked at the travel budget, and we discovered it had gone up by a factor of 4 after email had become popular and in heavy use. And we said, well, why is that? And it turned out we were only half right. What happened is that there were projects that were undertaken in the presence of electronic mail that covered more physical territory because you could overcome the time zone problem. So it meant that more people could be involved despite the fact that they used deferred communication instead of real-time telephone calls and conference calls. So that meant there were more people involved, and they were also physically located over a broader distance. So when they did have to get together, they had to travel over a farther distance, and there were more of them. So the travel budget went up instead of down. And this is an example of one of those counterintuitive outcomes. In terms of what else is going to happen, the presence of IP version 6 that I mentioned before will also allow for a vastly expanded sensor network environment. So there are an increasing number of sensors that are being put on the network. I have one in my house. It's an IPv6 radio-based sensor network. It automatically forms a mesh network, and it's sampling temperature, humidity, and light levels in every room in the house every 5 minutes. Now, I know that sounds like something only a geek would do, and I hope most of you would appreciate that. But the purpose is to get real engineering data in order to know at the end of the year how well my heating and ventilation system has actually worked. Should I be changing the fan rates and the baffling and all the other details that make heating and cooling work well. It also instruments the wine cellar. I'm very concerned about the temperature there. I need to keep it down below 60 degrees, and I need sufficient humidity so the corks don't dry out. So that's alarmed. And if the temperature goes above 60 degrees Fahrenheit, I get an SMS on my mobile saying, your wine is warming up. So, but I anticipate that as we become more and more conscious of the global warming problem and more conscious of our inefficiency in the use of energy, that more and more sensor systems and appliances will become part of this environment. So there's a smart grid program in the United States that was started 2 years ago and announced by the Secretaries of Energy and Commerce to instrument devices like lights and household appliances, things you find around the house, in the office, and in the car, and things you carry around on your person, in order for the energy management system to keep track of how you used energy. So at the end of the month, when you get a bill saying you used 10,000 kilowatts, you have some idea, what did I do to generate that bill, as opposed to just having to pay it and wonder what happened. So sensor networks are going to be a big part of this growing environment. After that, it gets really hard to predict, but I think medical instrumentation is another important evolutionary element in the internet. We will be sensing people using remote devices to keep track of health and health conditions. And finally, not to leave out biology, and setting aside for just a moment all the genetic stuff that's going on, which is incredibly powerful, uses a lot of computing power, but there's also neural electronic implants, which are not only with us today, but will continue to evolve over time. My wife has personal experience with this. She has 2 cochlear implants. These are devices that use computers to substitute for the inner ear. The devices take in sound, analyze to get the Fourier transform to see what frequencies are present in an incoming sound signal, and then electrically, artificially stimulates the auditory nerve inside the cochlea by sending pulses to stimulate the auditory nerve, which the brain interprets as sound. The implication of this is that we now know enough about how the sensory neural system works to fool the brain into thinking that it has an inner ear when in fact all it has is a computer. So my wife has 2 of these, and I keep thinking I should reprogram her speech processor so it has TCP/IP in it so that she could actually ask a question on the internet and get an answer back and it would come right into her head. Nobody would see it. Be a great way to cheat on a test. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. So that's just one step. Their ocular implants are another thing that's coming, and then spinal implants to overcome damage to the spinal cord, which prevent people from walking or using their hands. All of those things are, I think, reasonably predictable. The one thing which I think is not so predictable, and which you would hear in this room when Singularity University is meeting here, is Ray Kurzweil's speculation that at some point, maybe it's 2039 or 29, computers will have so many components in them that they will exceed the capacity of the human brain, at which point I think Ray hopes he's still alive and he can upload himself into a computer and achieve immortality that way. So I remain skeptical of this particular outcome, but it's an interesting speculation. I know you didn't ask a question to generate all those answers, but you got all those answers anyway, so thank you for asking. And I gather that you're coming to tell me I've run out of time. No.
Let me ask my boss.
I'm sorry, one more.
So it's kind of more like a verification question. Like you're talking about quantum entanglement, that it's not necessarily a means of communication, right? That it's just that it's saying that they're in complementary states. But then you said that like if you could actually force the particles to be in a certain state, then it would be like the basis for quantum communication and thus intergalactic communication. Can you like verify that a little bit?
Yeah, no, you got this basically right. If you can force this, remember, signaling is something that you do when you deliberately cause a signal to be generated in the waveform and the way in which you intend. So, I mean, the trivial example of this would be the telegraph, where you're tapping on the key. You are determining when the key is doing dit and when it's doing da. So you're controlling that. If all you could do was to measure what the state of the key was and know that the other end is in the opposite state, but you couldn't force the key down, then you wouldn't be communicating. You'd only be measuring correlations. So if it were true, if it were possible to force the state of a quantum particle into whatever state you wanted, then you would be controlling what the other side looks like. That's communication. Well, no, the other side, remember, if it's binary communication, it's easy for the guy to know that there's only 2 possible messages, 0 and 1, okay? And so if the message doesn't look right by reading the 0s and 1s that he's reading on the other side, all he has to do is invert the signal and he figures out what the message is. So you just look at both cases in order to figure out whether the message makes any sense. We're trivializing this some. But the important part is the volition. The ability to force the state is the only way that you could force communication. If you don't force it, it's just correlation. Okay.
I think we have a question.
From the net. Okay.
I'm waiting to finish.
I think this is really charming. The question comes on a piece of paper. I mean, this is really it's
Question, Sheila.
all right.
So the question is, it came through Twitter, why isn't Google interested in supporting a universal novel?
A A universal what?
What is that here? In a universal novel Mac without middle hardware. Does that make sense?
A universal, no, I don't understand the question exactly.
Back without.
Could I see this thing? You know, if you don't mind, let me see. It says, why isn't Google interested in supporting a universal novel?
A
Well-
universal novel Mac.
Novel Mac, without something hardware,
directly.
without,
Here, let's read it to her.
and now I have to show off my inability to read. Right?
So here's the
Why is
question.
it interested in supporting universal novel Mac? Oh, well, the question is whether he means medium Mac ID without middle hardware. That's an awfully terse question. It's not enough to really figure out what's going on there. Let me guess. This may be a response to the question of IP version 6, because that has a very large address space. But those of you who have any Wi-Fi equipment know that there's also a 48-bit number known as the MAC address. And I think this is probably related to why not support the MAC address. The honest answer is that it's only 48 bits. And I'm much more interested in the larger 128-bit address space. The guys that did the Mac used to work in my laboratory at Stanford, and they realized fairly early on that 32 bits wasn't going to be enough. I didn't realize it, but they did. So they did 48 bits. But now we know 48 bits isn't enough either. So I think if I've interpreted the question correctly, I want more address space than the 48 bits.
Well, I will tell you something. I am so excited to hear about computer technologies for physical problems. We all have a few of those as this little thing ages and does its gig. Very exciting news for me personally. And did everybody get what you needed? And is there one more question? Do we have time for one more? One more.
I see several hands are up there. This lady in the back, now am I going to be able to hear you?
Why don't you come forward if you would, please?
I don't want to be the deaf guy that came and didn't listen.
Why don't you
but
have cochlear implants?
because I have 2 hearing aids, and I don't need the cochlear implants yet, but eventually I will. All right, go for it.
Do you see the trend of technology getting more efficient, slowing or eventually stopping, and getting more and more efficient? Where will we go from there?
More and more efficient, but what's
And then stopping?
but what efficiency are we measuring here?
Maybe the size, but we can implement transistors and things on such a small scale, then eventually surely we're going to reach a limit of
You know what? I think that's. Is that me? Hold on. Let's say, would you mind just coming around here where I can lip read if I have to? I'm sorry, but that's the only way I can make this work. Because I am hearing impaired, and I don't have a cochlear implant, and I don't have an FM receiver like my wife does. So try again.
Well, I'm mainly interested in how, over the decades, technology has gone from room size to computers.
Oh, yes,
to
right.
iPods and
Yes.
laptops. And we're seeing a trend.
So the question is, how far down can we go?
Yes, and is there a limit? And if we reach
Yeah,
it,
okay.
where
So,
will we go?
all right. So, well, we're a long ways from reaching the limit. I was just reading the other day about the energy consumption that we currently use for our existing computers. We are 10 to the 8th times more energy wasteful than we could be in the theoretical limit. So we have about 100 million times to go in terms of energy reduction in energy utilization before we get to quantum limits on how you do a computation. It's also very clear that we're starting to get to the point where we can think about doing molecular kinds of computation, devices that are down at the molecular level, as opposed to the kinds of physical devices that we have today. So even though we have 1 billion transistors on a chip or more today, the numbers could get down to much, much larger numbers and much smaller space until we finally end up with very tiny molecular type devices. The part that is the most interesting to me right now is the possibility of using protein generation, protein fabrication, in order to create pieces of a molecular computer. We've reached the point now where we know how to generate artificial sequences of DNA. There's a man named Craig Venter who was involved in doing the sequencing of the human genome about, 10, 15 years ago, who is now experimenting with creating artificial life. And in the process of doing that, he is creating DNA sequences artificially which produce proteins. So if you could, you know how proteins sort of automatically fold themselves up into different shapes. So if you could create DNA sequences that would allow the proteins to fold in a way that you find useful, you could imagine fabricating a computing device using DNA sequences as the method for creating the physical components. So I think we are a long ways from running out of steam in terms of density of computing and amount of power required. The question is very relevant to us at Google because we have very large-scale data centers that consume large amounts of power. In fact, a typical data center might consume 125 megawatts or 128 megawatts of power. I don't know if you've ever stood next to a row of 64 2-megawatt generators, but it's an impressive, long, pile of equipment. And for a software guy like me to walk into a data center like this and realize you need this much physical computing capability in order to do these things with your software is quite stunning. I always think of software as this little thing you did in your laptop. But to do it at the scale that Google does, you need physical facilities that are gigantic. So the answer is we're a long ways from running out of steam. You'll be an old lady before that happens, and maybe not even then. Okay, so that's probably all the time we got because it's 9 o'clock. Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you.
So now we'll have our aerospace presentations. Can you please stay if you have the time?